Hello. We're live streaming, but welcome to episode 33 of Dualistic Unity. It has been a while since I've done an intro like that, and it is bringing me back to realize how long we have been doing this, man. Like the amount of shifts over the last 2.5 years, let alone like someone mentioned the Vermont retreat in August yesterday. They're like, that's less than a year ago. That was 10 months ago. And the amount, like, I get why life can feel so full because you start doing more things. You start having more variation in your day, not doing the same rigid, structured things. And it's been just to immediately get into some stuff here. It's been interesting, like seeing when you're not doing the habitual structured stuff, like sticking to a quote unquote routine that's like very, very curated, how much you start to see where those choices to live a certain routine came from. And most of them for me, like, weren't based on myself. They were based on things that I looked to, bought into, right ways of living, and kind of structured it to feel good about how I spent my day instead of like making decisions for myself. And I am realizing how fucking indecisive I can be, like to be able to make snap decisions. Again, you've said it before, like you want to get better at making decisions, just make more of them. And doing that and being willing to fall and stumble, like it feels easier to do when you're young, when you're a kid. And so I get why people don't want to change, don't want to shift their life, don't want to, start wondering how they want to spend their day without, the habitual stuff so much. But I'm like right in the midst of those sorts of things. And it's been interesting, like exciting, jarring, but certainly interesting.
Yeah, it definitely makes your life more full. And I think the reason isn't just that we are so used to structuring our day, but that we're structuring our feelings to a very large degree without recognizing that we're doing so. Like we have a structure to our day so we can feel a certain way, feel secure, feel like we're on the right path, feel like we're doing the right thing, feel valuable in ourselves. So we're really trying to structure our feelings. But in that, we go through the process of feeling certain feelings. And then the ones that we don't like, we run away from because that's not part of the plan. If I'm trying to feel secure and all of my life decisions are meant to perpetuate that feeling of security, then the feeling of insecurity is not welcome. And what do I do when I feel insecure? I think of the future or I think of the past. So immediately, I'm not experiencing the present to the same degree anymore because I'm running away from all of the experiences that aren't carefully curated into my structured day. And so when you're not doing that, all of a sudden you can feel that insecurity. And instead of running into the future or the past, you're still in the present. And so all those moments that were once lost in avoidance alone come back into your life. And that's why your days feel so full, is because you're actually allowing them to be what they are. You're feeling your own day as it happens instead of running away from the feeling into tomorrow and yesterday.
Yeah, that's definitely like realizing how much I've said it before, but like I've looked forward to things in my life. Like it's wild to realize how you spent, like looking back, you wonder, oh, things have changed a lot. You feel different. But then, when I look back at old videos, I'm like, it'll knock me around a little bit. But then it's like, part of me doesn't feel that much different than then. And part of me feels like, whoa, at least I'm seeing certain things. Like felt like I was, I don't know, very unaware of myself, despite feeling like, oh, I have, a lot of self-awareness. But that process of like just being willing to sit with insecurity and not, do the thing to feel better about yourself. Like even that sort of morning, rigid, structured morning routine as a way of just like boosting throughout the day. Like you spend time later in the day thinking back to it. I said it early on, like when I was meditating a lot, I would get like, I would try and think back throughout the day, like, did I meditate this morning? And if I did, I would feel better. If I didn't, I would feel like, oh gosh, can I handle the day? And it's interesting how we're able to pass off momentary shifts to something else. Well, at least, this will, even the thought like, well, this will pass, assuming that like what I'm correct in what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing right now. It's like kind of taking a superficial surface level look at the feelings and the things, and then jumping to a conclusion. And then instead of like sinking in to, just that feeling of insecurity of like, I don't know, even like, I don't know how the rest of my day is going to go. I don't know what's going to be discussed, talked about, what exactly I'm going to do. Like there is structure there, but then being willing to not not always do what you want, sort of. It's like a component of growing up, but then it's finding that balance between, doing certain things, like again, with working out. Like there's a part of me that like feels like I shouldn't do that, and it's like finding that mix, because it's all gray area. There's not
you shouldn't do that. See, there's no shoulds and shouldn'ts. You have to get rid of that entire thing. Like that's just like, again, another perspective of me, there's a right path. And so what would you do if there wasn't a should or shouldn't? Like if you were to just cut the thought off entirely, if there's weights in front of you, do you want to use them or not? And that's why I have weights on my floor, is so that way it's just that. It's just like, oh, there they are. All right, I'll pick those up. As opposed to, should I go work out? Should I commit a lot of time to this task? Why? And what's funny is that sometimes I won't feel like working out, but I'll be like, all right, I can do a few curls. I'm like, all right, I can do like a few squats. And then all of a sudden, like an hour's gone by, half hour's gone by, where I've just worked out like a motherfucker, right? But it wasn't because I should. It's because I was like, yeah, all right, I could kind of get into this. And then when I did, I was like, yeah, I can get into this. And that's at least authentic. You give yourself the chance to go down the path a bit, and then you're honest about whether or not you want to go down that path, instead of sitting at the fork going, shit, should I go that way? Should I go that way? Maybe I shouldn't go that way. Which way should I go? Go, just try one out, like until you sink too deep in it, you can always turn back most of the time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because like not to say it's the worst thing you can do, but something that you're gonna feel more consequences to is not deciding on stuff. And then having that like visceral response of thinking where it's like you're not doing something because it's like you thought to do something, then you're like, no, shouldn't, instead of like a lot of times you could just do something and then do something else and then do something else, and then your day becomes very full. But it's almost like that process of thinking about it, of considering, of weighing the options, because like as soon as there's a trickle of that, like there's so much there that opens up, like so many considerations, like so many things to think about, basically. But a lot of times it will stem from that initial sense of insecurity that like so often you can have this immediate response to that just kind of cuts it, but doesn't actually look at it or face it. Instead of, part of the process maybe is seeing what the side of not immediately going to that habitual response is, and then sometimes going through enough suffering in that spot where it's like, all right, I'm just going to start being more decisive about things and let things fall as they will and not think about it. Because I've, at least, especially in the last couple months, like experienced very much both, and both see like, when it isn't so many consideration and just do feel so obvious. And then as soon as you're not feeling that as much, you feel very far from that. And then it can almost build to a point where it's like, well, I've done this for so long, should just, like at some point you just got to cut it and be like, I stop now. And that's it.
It's the only time you can.
Yeah.
Isn't that the funny way? It's always going to be now. Always. And that's why it always feels totally new whenever you do stop. But See, I find it's funny because there's so many experiences we have where we see this in action. Speaking is one. Art, music, when it's played like live and people are just jamming, that kind of thing. Like to just get into it and not think about yourself is to find the flow, is to be able to add to the flow. But if you're thinking about it, you're insecure, like, oh, I'm not as good as these people. You're likely not going to enjoy it. You're not going to be part of that flow. Speaking, same thing. You can be going through a sentence, everything's going fine because you're really, really passionate about what you're saying, and all of a sudden you wonder about what was that word? And you hesitate for just 1 second, and the whole flow just gets fucking derailed. And you've got that thought of, no, where'd the flow go? But you didn't have to do that. The whole point was you had a moment of doubt. You had a moment where you could think about yourself, and you can let that moment go. And then the next time around, maybe you won't have that moment. And if you do, you won't care because it's just stumbling over a word. What's the problem with that?
It's a great question because I'll have that, like, admittedly, I can be so sensitive to stumbling over words that it's like, it's funny to rewatch. Kind of. It's also like, oh, Jesus, like let yourself be a bit. Cause I'll have, and with the vlog, especially like when we're filming vlog clips, especially because we're pretty baked most of the time, I'm like filming and I'll have this process going on, assumptions about how I'm expressing something or saying something or what's going on in the video, like as it's being filmed, and then I'll rewatch it and it's totally different. And this spot where I assume that, you know, I stumbled a bunch was actually like a totally fine thing. And that was the thing that hit me for social media. Like right before I started posting was like, I had a very strong narrative, actually not too different. Not too different than I feel these days when I think about myself. This sense of like, not confident, not a good speaker, can't articulate things well, not a good conversationalist. And that was like my narrative for a lot of my life, like certainties through my teenage years for sure. And it hit me once after my boss made my whole team record a client call. And I was nervous to do it. I was worried. I was like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I watched it back, totally fine. Everything I assumed about my responses, explanations, there was actually totally fine flow. And that like cut it for me in a sense, enough to then, you know, start putting myself out there more. But it can be, I was saying something before that. I don't really remember exactly.
Man, you've given me such a fucking great view of it though. Like it's so funny because inside our awareness, inside our consciousness, the entirety of our experience, it's like we're watching it on a fucking IMAX, like the world's most giant IMAX. In our head, every little flaw, every little thing, every little shade, every little thing, what we would judge as an imperfection is just right in our fucking face. You know, in the same way as if you were to take someone's face and stretch it out to be the size of an IMAX screen, right? You would start noticing, oh, wow, that person's got freckles. You know, I'd never seen that before. Right. So we see it like that in our awareness, no matter what it is we're thinking, perceiving, worried about, so on and so forth. But everybody else just sees it as if they were looking at a movie strip. Like they're only seeing the tiny little version. They're only seeing where you can't notice any of those things because the picture's not big enough.
Right.
And they're so busy with their own shit that's limiting the size of the picture that they can see as well.
And so those insecurities that you feel, like, they only feel big to you. And if anyone else has any sort of insecurity whatsoever, like they're seeing their IMAX screen. And so there isn't even space for that many of yours.
No.
Like to assume that someone else sees you in the same way or someone else even would know the insecurities. Because it's interesting, like the sort of narratives and even like everything we've talked about on the podcast, you know, like the story, like you've mentioned a number of times, that day that you realize like you never lived for yourself, this, you've been telling yourself a narrative this whole time. Like as much as we've gone through, you know, years of that being kind of what the conversation circles around, it's like the narrative you have in your head isn't you. Like it's like right there for me, especially recently, like going through changes, like it's right there all the time. Like as soon as I feel like I quote unquote prioritize myself or think about myself, like it is right there, ready to, it's like stepping up to the plate right here. It's like, oh, you want to think about yourself? Here's something. And there isn't, because for a while there's like you can create buffers by thinking about yourself
Absolutely.
and totally cut yourself off from reality and relationships and people in your life, just to get that little hit of like feel better about yourself. And it is gnarly. Again, it's like you can't guarantee anything, but it's like part of me now wants to I want to figure out the past 3-4 years and be like, holy fuck, was I that unaware of like myself, what I was showing?
You're just growing in awareness. That's all it is, and we can all do that. But this is the thing, like the feeling you have right now, like, fuck, holy shit, how did I not catch this before? You're going to have that again. And it's going to feel like, oh, how did I got caught up in myself and so on and so forth. But that's just part of the process of growing. It's just really funny. But it's really funny because we go through shit and that's how we learn. Like, oh, wow, I could really put myself through some shit. Like you can convince yourself of anything and then ride that emotional train until finally, everything around you starts to fall apart and you're like, oh my God, look, there's proof, blah, 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 blah. And then eventually you're just going to hit rock bottom and go, maybe I was wrong. Maybe all of that was just me trying to live for everyone else. Maybe that was just me trying to satisfy something that can never be satisfied, which is this sense of control. And that's why I've talked about this before. Then, in a lot of our conversations, I've leaned on faith, but I've often said that the core of like spirituality and even religion, when you break down the dogma and you really get down to the messaging and all that of the people who were experiencing it, not believing, but experiencing it, is always faith and humility. And faith, totally misunderstood, because people try to translate people try to translate that into faith in an idea, in a belief, in some sense of false certainty. And that's not faith, obviously. So what is humility then? And people would say, well, it's being humble, but that's still a you being humble. So that's not humility. That's egotism. So true humility is the dissolution of reliance on the ego as truth. It is the shrinking of one's own IMAX.
Yeah, and like not being able to guarantee what you're expressing, like what people are viewing, what even you're showing the world, or like that there is any like that hit of thinking about yourself any which way that just takes you away from reality, takes you away from taking action, from making decisions, just keeps you focused and then trying to figure it out. And it's like, if that's the root, then a lot of your decisions are going to be based on how you deal with that. These assumptions that are very specific based on your own experience and very personal, then you try to mitigate by living your life. And your life is to be lived in a way to like mitigate the stories. And then, if you are feeling good enough, like, again, it's not to say that like that is always the case, but it very much can feel like that, that your whole life is just and you don't even realize how much is under the surface there until you stop doing all of those things that are, in response to the assumptions. You're like, oh shit, I was making a lot of assumptions. I lived for years and years with the assumptions still there, but enough of a distance between them that I didn't almost remember them or look at them, or just like was in an environment where, you kind of figured that environment out in a sense. You adapted to that environment, but it's like, it's still not you. You just like molded yourself or like created something to fit. And then it's like, you're in a new environment and it's like, you go back, like those things you did in the existing environment aren't there in the same way, or they don't shield you in the same way. And you're really left with yourself moment to moment. And like, and it's like an option to, you want to build responses based on these assumptions again, or you want to stop making so many assumptions and like see what you can do when you're not telling yourself.
Yeah.
So many
Well,
stories.
very much the difference between someone who understood Buddha and a Buddhist. Because there very much is a difference there. Like, you're still holding on. You're still defining yourself. Therefore, there is still a self that you are holding on to and attached to. Otherwise, being a Buddhist wouldn't be a thing. You wouldn't need it. It wouldn't even make any sense to you, because that would be assuming that Buddha was Buddha and Buddha wasn't Buddha, which was Buddha's fucking point. Right? So it really just comes down to, again, there is that gap where you could be telling yourself a story and then still be responding to your triggers, but shielded by the story, right? Like, oh yeah, no, I'm gaining awareness, I'm expanding my consciousness, blah blah blah, and then all of a sudden you become insecure and you run from it to the future and the past again, right? And that reinforces the story, because you're probably going to run to a point in the past where you were stronger and felt more secure, and so on and so forth. But it really is just going moment to moment and not looking for that, and just continuing on, watching where those insecurities are. Like, for example, the other night we went to the pub. I ended up soaked with beer on one of my pant legs. Had to go up and sing in like 3 songs. Immediately, all the childhood fears of, oh God, people are going to think I wet myself, came up. And instead of trying to make myself feel better, I just went, well, that's funny that's still in there. Like, I've obviously not wet myself. I know this. Whether people think I did or not is kind of irrelevant. But I didn't know that as a child because I wanted to fit in. There was a totally different mentality. There was a totally different response based on how I perceived everything. I don't perceive it that way anymore. So now, all of a sudden, faced with the same habitual trigger, I was able to go, oh, that's habitual. That's interesting. That's actually not based on anything other than the assumptions I made before about my need to fit in, about my need for people to see me in a certain way, and then the value that went with that, and so on and so forth. But you can only face that stuff in the moment. Like, you can't be sitting at home reading a book hoping that this is going to bring you to a moment of consciousness or enlightenment or anything like that. You can't be banking on a certain diet or a certain type of exercise or anything. You can't bank on a conversation, nothing. Dualistic unity, you can't bank on that. You can't do any of that. But what you can do is just pay attention moment to moment to moment and recognize that most of your fear responses come from the illusion of yourself. They come down to that idea of yourself, and that's okay. I think that's it. Like, there's nothing wrong with the thoughts that are going through your head. And I found this to be a fascinating part of the conversation we had on Patreon the other day. Quick shout to all our Patreon followers and supporters. Thank you so much for making all of this possible. We were talking about how thought can inform what we're saying. And I wonder about that. I really do, because I'm not necessarily convinced that we are totally in control of what we're saying. I think what we're saying is very much like how we're moving, like it's an expression of what we are. And that, as with epiphenomenology or epiphenomenalism, there is this thing that happens where the brain's already doing its thing, and then thought happens after the fact, taking ownership of the thing. Like, no, I did that because of this. But the thought happens after the thing. So if our words are the same, if in fact we are always expressing something that the body is going to express regardless, then perhaps all of our thoughts are not in fact informing the words, but rationalizing the idea that we're in control of those words. And so that maybe that changes the inflection, maybe that changes the tone, maybe that changes a lot of things. It distorts the message, but I don't know if it necessarily changes what we're saying.
Yeah, like we almost use the thoughts to rationalize what we say or do or make assumptions about it, and then don't realize that we're already talking. And like, if you're thinking about yourself and how you're doing and what's going on, like there's going to be, it's almost like trying to put it beforehand and like come up with some curated thing because you want to maintain some perspective of yourself or like see yourself in a certain way. But the trade-off is that you hesitate more, you're not as involved in what's going on. But there is like just in the world, like how many like stopgaps or borders or things there are to like, keep yourself under control, like stay under control. Like, it's crazy how much you can hear that, in the world. Like, control your mind, control yourself. Hey, control yourself over there. You hear that as a kid sometimes, or like even in school, like, hey, stay under control, everyone. And like control is thrown around like all over. And yet it's especially as a kid that can be really, really jarring, and it puts you on a track. But you said something before that reminded me of, there was a point I think you mentioned when, I don't know, last year maybe, where you mentioned how to like, not to like overcome certain fears or insecurities, but possibly you almost have to like re-feel them or experience them and realize they don't mean anything about you, because there can be such a depth built on, certain experiences, like things that maybe, quote unquote, like traumatic things, different for everyone, that you thought meant something about you, and they stuck for a while, and they like left an imprint almost on your brain, neurons, whatever. And so re-experiencing them and realizing it doesn't mean anything about you. Like I had totally forgotten that until you mentioned, like, you have to do the things, like you have to be involved. You can't be reading about it. You can't be thinking about it. You just have to do things and be there for it. Like it reminded me of that sense of almost having to go through, not the experience and do it well, but like go through the experience in the same sort of way that you have, because it's still there if you've used things to distract yourself from it or take yourself away from the reality that you were in when, here now, when you did experience that thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting process, because it's a process of unraveling layers according to how you've built them over time. Like say somebody identifies as a Christian, and they identify as a Christian for reasons that they haven't really explored. All they know is that they've invested in it for a long time. And so when you talk about Christianity, they have a reaction according to Christianity. But then let's go fast forward 10 years in the future. They've let Christianity go. They've realized that they were holding on to it because it made them feel better. It made them have a community. They had the ability to fit in. It gave them a sense of control, none of which they've thought about up until that point. But now all of a sudden they're looking at that a little deeper. Now they have an insight about how they identify with their nation, right? Or how they identify with how much money they make, or the neighborhood that they live in. All insights that couldn't have happened until they peeled away that first one, which was the one that they were the most focused on. Get that one out of the way, and all of a sudden the other ones start to appear, right? But it's through going through the experiences again of looking at those things for the first time. Because once upon a time, you came to a point in your life where somebody's like, you can make a lot of money, you can be in control, you can have what you want, you can be happy, you can have the white picket fence, the whole thing. And to somebody who was trying to survive in the world, that sounds like the greatest promise ever. You're just like, yeah, fuck, sign me up. And you want that because it gives you that sense of control, because all of a sudden now there's a way to ease your fear, or at least that's what it looks like. And so you make the choice to invest in that. And then years later, as you start to peel away all of that need to avoid your fear, you end up coming back to choices like, well, do you want to re-sign a lease for a brand new version of your car, or are you good with the old version of your car? And you're just like, I'm not really trying to be anything anymore. And boom, you're faced with that choice again. Like, do I need the new car? What will people think if I don't have the new car? And because you've let go of your fear, or rather because you've let go of your need to avoid your fear, you feel it and you go, well, fuck those people. Which means that, as you start driving around your old car more often, you still feel the fear from time to time. Somebody looks at you, you're like, oh God, are they judging my car? And you're like, well, fuck them if they are. And eventually you just stop thinking about it. You just stop thinking about it. Things change over time, but it's the process of going through things that at one point you didn't understand the choices that you had, and then going through them again.
Right. Yeah. There is no guarantee one way or the other. Even if you do, like getting the car, for example, or getting, even like cleaning your apartment versus not cleaning your apartment. Someone shows up to your apartment and you're like, oh, it's all clean. They're going to be happier because it's clean. And like that person may get there and then immediately judge themselves for how dirty their own apartment is. And so there was and it's all, for me, like you feel good about yourself, and there's never that guarantee one way or the other. And so even with that, with making decisions like one way or the other, especially when you start, I don't know, not like feeling more judgment, but just like understanding that you act differently than you have in the past, or you feel like you're showing or sharing just more of yourself, like publicly, especially with us, like showing stuff on social media and being like doing live things. Because, like, at least in my experience, like social media was a very individual thing throughout and like a controlled thing, kind of thing that I edited. And now it's not so much. And so it's more fun, but it's also, I feel very different posting. And there's sides of me that's like, part of me wants to start a new account and just like start from scratch, or like, block anyone who doesn't live in Nanaimo and just like post in Nanaimo stuff, whatever. But it's like, that's all. There's no like, there's so much sense of, well, I can control things, instead of just being yourself and letting the chips fall. Because again, you start to shift, and like, why do we assume so much that shifts are not great? Like, there could have been tons, which, looking back at things, I'm like, oh, I'm sure there was just whatever. I'm not going to sit here like woe is me type shit on here, but like, you don't even know, as you start to change and act differently and feel different, like what any response is going to be. And again, I get so focused on other perspectives sometimes, and it's like, they're so irrelevant. You're not going to know one or the other. Like, what about yourself? Like, how are you doing with things? And that is oftentimes like, should be your only question with stuff. Because like, once you start I don't know, like being more self-honest, like things make sense. Like you're paying attention more to reality. Like there's things that are going on that like make more sense. It doesn't have to be so many questions about what to do, but it's a practice, especially when you feel like, yeah, you're just like showing a lot, sharing a lot, doing a lot of things that are out there. It's like, you're always doing that, though, whether you feel like it or not. It can just feel like it's a smaller scale, I guess.
Yeah, it's that process of looking at unresolved need. It really is. Like, the perspective of others is so interesting, because there's kind of this loop. Like, we never ask ourselves this. Like, we're always afraid, oh God, what will other people think? But we never carry that through. Okay, what is it we're afraid of exactly? Because if they disagree, that's fine. Nobody gives a shit if they disagree. Like, hey, thanks for disagreeing. Appreciate the input, right? So what are we afraid of? Basically, that we're going to be shunned, that these people aren't going to want to be part of our life anymore. But do we ever think to ourselves, if they are that kind of person and they would react like that to us genuinely doing what we want with our life, without any malice or any intent to hurt others, without any consequence to anyone else, this is just my own choice, and this person actually has the response of, well, and fuck you, I don't want to be part of your life, is that a person we want to be part of our life? Then what the fuck are we thinking about? And it's that we never take it in like that. It's like, hold on. If any of my friends were doing something they genuinely wanted to do with their life, and I didn't agree with it, that's none of my fucking business. Like, I've had Christian pastors that are friends of mine. We have talked. We've disagreed about things and still hung out and chatted, and everything was fine, because live and let live. And some people are okay with that. And the others that aren't, they got shit to deal with. They've got their own problems, and maybe you getting out of the way is the best thing for them.
Yeah. Being able to work through stuff on their own too. And like, especially when you feel like you've lived certain ways in your life, or like bought into certain, expectations, and then not doing that so much more. And like, but yeah, like just living your life, it's like, of course it wouldn't make sense, of course, but like, it can feel, there's still the reality of this experience and everything that's going on from the, yeah, just all the feeling standpoint, but it wouldn't make any sense. And so it is interesting kind of going through cycles of this, feeling like, oh, there were certain things you've overcome, and then coming to terms with the fact that you haven't. But then it's like, what does that even mean to overcome something? That's not a thing that's happening. Your life just keeps changing. And to assume that you've overcome something means that you think that you have control in that every time you go in.
You're a victim because you haven't overcome it. So it's
until you do.
Exactly.
Fucked. Fucked until you do it. Oh my God. And then it's like, well, what are you going to spend your whole life? Like, could die tomorrow. Or are you going to overcome, quote unquote, everything you think you got to overcome? If you could write a list of everything that you think is wrong with you, or you think you have insecurities about, or you think you need to improve, like, you could spend a full day writing that list down. For most people, I would guess, if you really dig into it, if you get into the nitty gritty of specific situations, there's no guarantee how many of those situations would even happen. And there's no guarantee of how long you're going to have to experience that anyway. And so to prioritize, overcoming insecurities, or assume that, like, oh, well, I can't go into this situation, for me, like, just with conversations, even my sensitivity to like the stumbling on words, feeling like you have nothing to say, sometimes, like, it can just, I'll go into a pit, like, where it's an initial sort of feeling, and then it's like the thought of getting out of that, despite it just being able to be happened right now. It's like, oh, there's a sense of, like, investment, almost, in doing something for a while, and then it's like, well, might as well just keep doing this instead of not. But that shift, it's like, and being willing to jump into to situations where maybe more insecurities would come up, like, that's the process of working through, of, like, quote unquote, overcoming, but not for that case. And, like, going into a situation assuming, like, I'm doing this, I'm going out tonight, I'm gonna talk to 5 people to overcome my social anxiety. It's like, then every situation is going to be for a reason, for a purpose, instead of like, oh, I'm going to go talk to people to meet some people. Yeah, there's some insecurity that's there, but that's not going to stop me, instead of it being the reason that you're doing it. Because a lot of your life can start to feel like that.
It's funny because, again, we keep going through the different cycles, and it's not about overcoming it, but I think it's, again, recognizing that the fear response that drove your previous choice wasn't necessarily based in reality. And the more you go through all those, the more you really start to cycle down to where a lot of this shit comes from. So here's a fun thought experiment. We haven't done this in a little while. I want you to imagine yourself, and this is an ideal situation. If your situation wasn't like this, I understand where you're coming from, but let's just go with it from here. Ideal situation. You are a baby. You are warm, happy in the womb, and then one day you were born into the world where it's a lot of light and sound and fucking loud noises, and there's people touching you, and there's cold, and there's all of this stuff, and it's a lot. But then somebody holds you, and you feel more secure, and you feel safe. And as you grow up and you get a little bit bigger, you have this person or these people, maybe many people if it's one of those families, and they all give you a sense of community where you don't have to do anything. You feel like you belong. You feel safe. And then one day you're taken to this new place where there are other children that you do not know, and there are adults that you do not know that are you are told to listen to. And at first, everything is just fine. And maybe you make friends on your first day. Maybe you make friends early on. Maybe your first teacher or first couple of teachers were really dope people, right? Because they loved kids. But as you continue to go through this environment, and it keeps going year after year after year, suddenly now there are different kinds of kids who are more judgmental. As these kids get older and you get older, all of a sudden there are new types of insults. There are new things to judge yourself for. There are new experiences, new emotions. And now there is this need to fit in, because if there wasn't that need to fit, if we didn't fit in, now we're experiencing something we didn't experience before, aloneness. And because that aloneness doesn't involve any of the comfort that previously went with it, we turned it into loneliness. And from there onward, so many more of our choices are to avoid that loneliness from the original assumption that we needed to fit in. because that's where safety was, because that's where we started, was in that feeling of safety. And now as we go back, we can look at where that need to fit in came from. We can look at, the fear and the reasonable fear, because we were children.
Mm-hmm.
Children, we didn't know how to survive in the world. We barely knew how to speak, right? We didn't know how to cook. We couldn't do anything to take care of ourselves. We didn't understand the craziness of the adults around us that had created this arbitrary game of money and war, right? And so much of the choices that we make goes back to that original, I don't want to feel lonely. But the lonely was an optional perception of alone, because we had always been alone from the very start. It's just that the environment suddenly shifted, and it perpetuated that illusion of division when it was never really the case. We were never divided.
Wow, that hit me. That since that point, that feeling of it really, like when it boils down, like that sense of being alone, like alone in yourself, born alone, die alone, and that because it's one of two perspectives. It's like that's where freedom or loneliness and depression lie, in like being either in a pit or free from all of the expectations. But it's like if you're doing both, then it's going to feel lonely, alone, frightening, instead of feeling like just opportunity, just like opportunity. Like all of a sudden, everything is back on the table. Like you can take your life in all different sorts of directions. You can spend your day doing things. And as long as you're staying responsible and like paying attention, like you can allow life to inform you instead of having this underlying like, well, is this going to make me alone?
Yep.
It's like you're already alone in everything that you do. You're already alone in the choices that you make. You're already alone in your perspective of how you're doing, how something's going, how your life is going. And you can really like, I've mentioned, and again, I can only speak to my own experience, but I've mentioned it a number of times in high school. Like, so much of my life is just like opening up in a lot of ways when it's again when it's focused on, and when it's not, then it's not. I'm doing what I'm doing right now. We're filming an episode talking about whatever we're going to end up talking about on the episodes, which right now happen to be this. But in high school, it was like, I don't want to be disliked. That was like a thing. And it got me to a point where like I didn't jump in to situations. Like I was, oh man, like so like practically mute in a sense. Like I had some close friends that I would interact with, but like outside of that, like
we shared that
there,
like a lot of people go through high school, they don't even have those close friends. I mean, it's a universal experience. I mean, not everybody goes through it exactly like that, but at some point they really come face to face with the fact that they feel alone. So let's say you go through high school and you're prom king or the star football player or whatever the fuck it is. Shortly after that, at some point you start to realize that all those high school friends have got kids. They're moving on with their jobs. They're moving out of the state. They're moving out of the country. Like they're just moving on, and everything starts to change. And now they get to face that shit that a lot of people had to face in high school.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it comes for everyone at some point. And like, that's the thing, is even if you don't feel like, you're as alone, there's still like underlying discomforts, like moment to moment assumptions, like, and even with like, if you're not making so many judgments and just realize you're kind of left with yourself, like, what was that quote? Like, you're the full way there if you're judging other people, you're halfway there if you're only judging yourself, and then you're quote unquote there if you're not doing either. Yeah. Obviously you're not there, but it's like you're gonna make your life a lot easier, that's for sure. You start to realize when you're left with just your own judgments, seeing that it all comes from you, like, oh, judgment is used as a way to like respond to not judging yourself. Like there was a need to do that, and that experience of like judging someone or assuming or talking about someone else, like that doesn't feel good. Like no one's having an enjoyable experience. I never had enjoyable experiences when it was like conversation about how someone else was living their life, like what other people are doing. It was just way to pass the time, way to feel, it's just a way to feel better about yourself and how you feel like you're living your life, and assuming that person is living life somehow incorrectly. It's just different, and there's nothing there that actually exists in reality at all. Like there is, and I say that and it's like, yeah, but it's there in reality. It's just not based on anything.
No,
It's standard, like anything standardized.
this has been a good episode. Definitely. And again, like, I think the point, as always, is to just live.
Yeah.
Live your life, get out there, have experiences with people, have conversations with people, watch where you're judging them, watch where you judge yourself, watch the thoughts. Don't resist the thoughts. Don't try to get rid of the thoughts, but instead look at them. And what you'll find is if you can just look at them with a certain degree of clarity, they are all centered around something that you are not. All of them. There is an underlying structure to all of these thoughts. And it's not that there's some plague called the ego. It's not that this is a bad thing. But without awareness of that happening, it is so easy to fall into the idea of you and think that it's actually you. Because we can superimpose what is with our perception of what is. And they look the same. And it's only through self-honesty. It's only through humility and being willing to surrender whatever sense of value you're trying to establish. And it's only through faith in accepting the uncertainty of here and now that you can feel the difference between what you want to see and fear to see and what is actually there.
And that is where you can actually start, like, having some sense of freedom, like actually just living your life. You don't need to do it for a reason or a purpose, but when you're left there, it's like it feels like there's more opportunity to like go one way or the other instead of maintaining that habitual perspective. But yeah, this has been fun.
This has been fun.
Yeah,
we should do at least one or two announcements here before the end of this episode. We have a new schedule. After recording this episode, we're actually going to be taking a short break and then continuing on 6 p.m. Eastern time on a Monday, which is a totally new thing for us. Our schedule during the weekdays has shifted forward so that way we are more accessible to our audience, not just in the episodes that we record live, but also in the groups that we do on Patreon. We are going to have a Patreon group later on tonight as well, if you can join us there. Lastly, we have a retreat coming up November 2nd, Port Alberni. Right now, the tickets are only available on Patreon. Tier 2 got access to the tickets on Sunday. Tier 1 gets access this coming Sunday, and then it will be publicly available a week after that. I should mention that if you are interested in going to this event, and I highly recommend it, this is a full event, which means that it goes from Saturday the 2nd till Sunday the 10th of November. There's a chef, there's a hot tub, there's a pool table, there's karaoke, there's an outside gazebo, we're on the river, we're going to do some whale watching, there's provincial parks nearby, but we're in the bush already anyway. It's just fucking gorgeous. Live music, yoga. This is what the Dualistic Unity retreats were meant to be. If you are interested in that, I would recommend getting onto Patreon now, because we listed the tickets for this last Sunday to Tier 3. There were 13 tickets available. We are currently down to 5.
Just 5. Yeah, they went quick. They're going quick. They're not even public yet. They're going to be Tier 2 next week, or Tier 1 next week, on Tier 2 until next week when they go on Tier 1. But yeah, it's making our way back to West Coast River Lodge. Fuck yeah, with lots of dope shit that we're doing. So
it's gonna be awesome.
It's been fun. Appreciate everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.